Well, hello everyone. We are in chapter 9 of the book, Andy Stanley's Irresistible. And we're getting into some good stuff, in my opinion, some good stuff, some interesting stuff, some things that maybe need to be clarified about the book. There's someone in our church who posted about this book and how Andy's off on some things. And I agree that he goes a little too far on some things, and I'll bring those up as we get to him. But I also think we have to keep in mind who he's writing to and who he has in mind in the way that he preaches and teaches and writes. And it's mostly non-believers. In this book, I think he has more believers in mind because of the way he teaches it. But he's wanting us as Christians to see the importance of making it clear and simple to reach non-believers and address some of the issues that they have, people who have abandoned the church. And I love that throughout the book he is constantly teaching scripture, right? He'll share a verse or several verses and then teach on it. And whether you agree with his interpretation or not, at least he's doing that. So anyway, I appreciate his approach and the way he's doing this. But let's get into it. So chapter 9, he basically talks about Jesus sharing a new spin on these verses, these statements in starting in Matthew 5 in what is commonly called the Sermon on the Mount. And he writes about how Jesus came to fulfill the law and gives examples of that. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, I say, and so he takes these laws and then teaches on them with authority, which would have been controversial. Jesus was often controversial. Are you getting that point? Seems to be the case, doesn't it? And then Andy does a great job of explaining what it means that Jesus came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And I remember having this question for the longest time before I entered ministry in high school and college. Like, what does it really mean that Jesus fulfilled the law? That he didn't come to abolish it, he came to fulfill it. And I was confused. And even when I became a pastor and started ministry, I don't think I had a succinct answer. And I think before reading this book, I could have given you a reasonable answer. I've come far enough in ministry to be able to do that. But I like how he teaches what it means that Jesus came to fulfill the law. He describes it or explains it as to fulfilled means to bring to a designated end. So this idea that the covenant was temporary and was preordained from the beginning of time when God established it with the people to be temporary and for it to end at some point so that something new could emerge. And of course, we read over and over again in Andy's writing, Jesus came to bring something new, right? He continues to explain what that means and does a good job of it. One section in this chapter that was pretty interesting that I think it's important to name and talk about is on bottom of page 110. And I think as we get further in the book, he's going to start talking more about this. And so we need to be prepared. Well, on the bottom of page 110, he says this: most evangelicals feel the need to defend the entire Bible, including God's temporary covenant with Israel, in order to defend Christianity. Why? He says. Because of our time-honored tradition of mixing, matching, and equating what God clearly separated. And he says he knows people who have abandoned the church because of the Old Testament and some of the teachings in the Old Testament. And he says that part, the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, he says that part doesn't apply to or include us. And that's why we can abandon it, basically. I understand what Andy's trying to do. And he said this earlier. He's trying to unhitch Christianity from the Old Testament. And on some level, I get it. Like, why complicate it? Why talk about these laws and this covenant when we're under a new relationship, new covenant with Jesus. And I preach, like, we're not bound by this old covenant anymore. We have a new covenant in Jesus where Jesus did everything, and all we have to do is say yes and live for Jesus, right? And it's more about relationship than obeying laws. Obeying laws is part of when we are close to Jesus and form this relationship. Jesus will obey the laws just because we're in relationship with Jesus, but it doesn't start with the laws. It starts with the relationship with Jesus. Okay. So he uses this language that it doesn't apply to us or include us. Now, what you have to understand is Andy Stanley preaches and teaches from these stories in the Old Testament. And so he's not saying that the Old Testament doesn't matter. He's not saying that the Old Testament isn't relevant. He's not saying that the Old Testament isn't important. He said earlier he thinks it's important. You know, I think about, it's about reading the Old Testament in the right context. And not the whole Old Testament. It depends on what you're reading. You read wisdom literature different than you read some of the history and some of the stories of the kings and prophets, right? Like in Ecclesiastes, the author says everything is meaningless. That's not truth. That's a wisdom saying. That's Solomon wrestling with experiencing everything life has to offer and feeling like everything is meaningless. And at the end of Ecclesiastes, he comes to the conclusion that what really matters is living for God. That's the conclusion he comes to. But he writes out his thoughts and his processes, and it's wisdom literature. We don't take everything as a command or promise in that. We read it as wisdom literature or as poetry, so to speak. Proverbs is wisdom literature, wisdom teaching. It's not commands and promises. But things like iron sharpens iron. I can't speak. Iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. From Proverbs 27. That's a beautiful teaching. That we experience as true, and that we need to remember. This comes back to what I've taught and shared with the church. That the Bible is a library. It's not a book, it's a library with lots of different genres and authors, and you have to know what you're reading and when it took place and why they wrote it, who wrote it, and why they wrote it, and when they wrote it, and how they wrote it, as what kind of literature. And that's what helps us understand the Old Testament correctly. So I don't love Andy's language here, that it doesn't apply to us or include us. I get what he's doing, but I wish he used a little bit better language around that. So then, I hope that makes sense. So then Andy concludes the chapter with talking about what it means that it is finished when Jesus dies on the cross. And then we get into chapter 10, which was a pretty long chapter. So I'm gonna do more summarizing it than anything else. I can't even find the beginning of it. Oh man. But this was definitely a long chapter. I highlighted a few things I want to share with you. But basically, what he does is he starts with the Great Commission, Matthew 28, and he points out something that I had never really thought about that was kind of cool. That Jesus was intentional. I've always thought Jesus was intentional about what he included in the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing, I'll be with you to the ends of the earth. But I've never thought about how he was intentional about what he excluded. He excluded anything about the law or Moses to try to appeal to Jewish people. I've never thought about that. I think that's kind of cool. This was his intentional call to the church to follow Jesus. And then he spends quite a bit of time going into Paul's calling and gives this kind of fun, fictional thing that might have happened between Jesus and God. Peter's calling, and then the Jerusalem and kind of what led up to what we know of as the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. And it's good stuff, and he'll share scripture, explain it, share scripture, explain it, and share the story of Paul and Peter kind of arriving at where they did, and kind of Jewish Christians, people who were Jewish who became followers of Jesus, where they were, and the division. The division was around circumcision and following the law of Moses. When someone becomes a Christian, at that time, it was seen as another form of Judaism. So the question was, do they do the things that's necessary for someone to become Jewish? And Paul and Barnabas say no. Peter, Paul, Barnabas, James, they say no. They don't need to get circumcised and follow all these laws. And of course, some, Jewish religious leaders who have become Christians say yes, they do. And it divided the early church, and they land on this idea that they don't, with a few small exceptions that he talks about, mostly around dietary laws and sexual immorality are the two ones that he requires for someone who becomes a Christian to follow. That's kind of carried over from Jewish law, and it's almost, Andy explains it as almost a compromise, like. Jews have to give something up, which is all the law. Christians has to give something up, which is following just some of the law. It's kind of how it seems to me. But I love how Andy Stanley reminds us that in that text, like Peter is the one who reminds the Jews, this was a burden we couldn't carry. Why would we put this on people who are starting to follow Jesus? Which is a great question to ask, that Peter asks. All right, I highlighted, let me, page 130, let me turn to it. When Andy explains the Jerusalem Council and what happened, he has this powerful paragraph that really jumped out to me. It's on the top of page 130. He says, the decision of the Jewish Council is mind-boggling. Against every Jewish fiber in their Jewish bodies, they determined that Gentiles everywhere would have access to the God of their fathers without making a single trip to the temple and without sacrificing a single animal. All the benefits, none of the blood. But what's more mind-boggling than that, they decided unity in the church was more important than the law of Moses. Unity in the church was more important than the law of Moses. And it just makes me think about what's happening in the Methodist Church right now around kind of our understanding of biblical sexual ethics. There's probably going to be a split, and I'll talk about that more at some point, but that's what it reminds me of. And what does it mean to have unity in the midst of that, I think, is the question I was asking. It just reminded me, of that. And then Andy does a good job of explaining, like, the reason Paul wrote all these letters is because Jesus came to bring something new, and they were disconnecting from kind of Old Testament Jewish law in those ways and trying to live for Jesus, and it was new, and so Paul had to kind of explain what that looked like, and people were wrestling with that. And it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I've never really thought of it in that way, but that's what happened. So anyway, some good stuff here. We will do chapter 11. I still haven't read ahead. Probably 11 and 12. Yeah, we'll do 11 and 12 next time. So thanks for joining me. Y'all take care. All right, bye-bye.